that have happened in this country and that anybody here is likely to be speaking on for a long, long while. To think that Grace, as she's been called, was intellectually, physically disabled after complications at birth, non-verbal, born to a teenage mother in a mother and baby home, a very, very difficult start in life, and then placed in foster care, the care of the state. Grace lived with a foster family in the southeast of the country for 10 years after concerns were first raised about alleged neglect and abuse in that home. And it's actually incredible how many warnings were given and people are told to speak up and if they see something, but yet these were not acted upon. And Minister, we still have no answers as to why. So in 1992, the family of another girl who stayed at the house raised concerns. The Brothers of Charity stopped placing people in that home. In 1995, Grace showed signs of abuse. In 1996, the Health Board removed her, but then this was overturned and she was put back. Plans to remove Grace in 1991 and 2001 were not implemented, and so we have this horrific catalogue of errors. And again, we see a whistleblower coming forward in 2007, and Grace's own birth mother having to request that she be removed when hearing of the abuse. Increasing pressure pushed the government to set up a commission in 2017. It was due to report after 2 years, was continually postponed. Marjorie Farrelly was the sole investigator chosen. And here we have more questions that need to be answered, Minister. There needs to be serious questions about the type of investigations that we set up. There seems to be an inordinate amount of faith in people in the legal profession, be they senior counsels or judges, to conduct investigations. And we're now left with an investigation that cost €13.6 million, has 2,000 pages, 6 volumes, but doesn't make any major findings against the family, and didn't establish that Grace had been subjected to abuse, either emotional or sexual, and that there was no proof, going against everything that the whistleblowers and so many others had said, and the reason that she was taken out of that home in the first place and paid massive compensation by the state. How can we justify that Grace was not interviewed for this investigation? I'm aware she's profoundly disabled and non-verbal, but that has been heavily criticised, that ways were not found to do that. Not going ahead with the second phase of the investigation into the placement of other people into that foster home, and also into Fran, another one of the children in the same house as Grace's family, who came out yesterday talking about the experiences that Fran had, in particular the extreme frustration with the report, in particular, and that submissions made on behalf of Grace were not included in the report in the end. Similarly, also, that the state, in stopping the investigation into the second part, around the experience of the other children, with Fran being one of those being left out. Why has that decision been taken, Minister? And Fran's family also gave evidence as well. There are so many issues which I don't have time to tease out, but I want to bring out some of the wider issues from this. The first is the wider fact that the state does not care about children in this country. And it certainly cares even less about disabled children, because the way the treatment that Grace had, the many, many failures just speak to that. TUSA was found in 2024, as an example, to have paid out $14 million to 2 for-profit agencies to provide accommodation for children, one of which staff were not vetted and did not do child protection training despite dealing with vulnerable children. It was also found that this company was used to house 2 children in need of emergency accommodation after the company was blacklisted. Similarly, in a 2024 report, the Child Law Project found that when a child needed to enter care for disability in specialised units, there wasn't staff available. So many issues again and again being raised. Among them, Tusla earlier this year was found by HICWA to have serious issues in terms of lack of social workers, leading in particular in the Dublin area, where 300 children are left without support, stuck on a waiting list where they're deemed as low or medium priority. And we know, of course, of the CDNT waiting lists, so even in my own area, are up to 7 years in one part of Dublin West for children with disabilities and neurodivergence. Tusla also has noted this, but repeatedly said that due to the increase call for its services in its report for last year, the first 9 months referrals of 70,000 plus, which 2% more than the same period in 2023, and more than likely when the final number appeared, the highest number of referrals in its history. Despite this, and the acknowledgement by Tusla that it would need 500 social workers to meet the need, at the minute, according to the head of the Irish Association of Social Workers, that number roughly is 250. Minister, those are the issues facing you going into this. And you need to take action so that there is the recruitment that's needed, the housing that's built for essential workers, and the wages and conditions that will make people be attracted to stay working in this very, very difficult environment of social work and in the caring professions. There are so many other issues here, but I think there needs to be a massive apology to the family of Grace for what she experienced, and of course to Grace herself.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move to Deputy McAuliffe. You have a maximum of 15 minutes, Deputy.
Look, and I thank the House for allowing us time to continue to debate on this Farrelly discussion that just began last week. I suppose this is a number of commissions have reported to this House in my time as a TD, and certainly a number of them have left the victims or the people at the centre of those reports very dissatisfied with the outcome. And I suppose we do have to ask ourselves a question that an independent commission, and I think it's important to repeat that it is a commission independent of government, that model of establishing facts, the cost of it and the outcome for those people at the centre of it, I think it is essential now that we re-examine whether that model is appropriate and whether that model is a way that we move forward. And I suppose a quasi-judicial or a legal approach certainly allows us to publish a report that is publishable and that ensures that it's defendable and so on from a legal perspective. But I suppose from a social care perspective, what many people will want to know is what changes need to be made for Grace, what changes need to be made for other people in that same situation, and what changes need to be made going forward. And I know the Minister has talked about adult safeguarding legislation, and I look forward to the work that will happen on that. I suppose I was particularly concerned in regard to the statement that was made by Mary Claire Butler, the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of the Court. And I suppose the reason I was concerned is that, I'm being no expert in this area, certainly the General Solicitor put forward the case that she had made submissions to the Commission, not for her own interests, but both in the interest of Grace and in the public interest. And her indications that those submissions were not referred to in the report itself is deeply worrying. It's deeply worrying for the system of wards of court that we have. It's deeply worrying because we knew from the very outset that Grace, as somebody who was non-verbal, would not be able to give verbal testimony, and it is worrying in that when one legal office makes a submission to an independent tribunal, any lay person would assume that there will be cognizance given of that, and perhaps there will be more said on that in the future, because I do believe that we do need to consider this more fully, Minister. I've heard mention in the House that that this should be followed by discussion at the Disability Matters Committee when it is established, and as a future member of that committee, I would welcome that opportunity. And as I would say, I think there's two elements of it. You know, for social care cases like this, is a commission of inquiry the right model? Does it deliver any value? And I use that word very loosely. I'm not talking about taxpayer value. I'm talking about having an outcome that actually changes the individual circumstances for the person concerned, gives them a sense of justice, a determination of justice, and also makes changes to the system. I have to say, I spent, during the Easter recess, I spent some time trying to consume this report. It was incredibly difficult to do that in its layout, in its formatting, and perhaps that's because it is an incredibly complex case. But I have to say, having listened to Deputy McGuinness speak on this matter at the Fianna Fáil parliamentary party meetings over the years that I have been a member, he has spoken very passionately about this case, and I suppose whatever I know about it, it's in some small part to the Deputy's contributions to our meetings. So while it is incredibly complex and it involves lots of different communications between officials and so on, I found it very difficult to find a consolidated version of the Commission's findings. I found it very difficult. I had to, you know, you're really actively using the find function in your PDF to try and piece together it. And you know, the failure to have an executive summary, I think, was a failing. I think in the past, executive summaries were criticised because they did not give the result that perhaps many people wanted. And I refer to the Mother and Baby Home executive summary, which I think many of us in the House called for the at the time for the Independent Commission to withdraw. They felt it was offensive and so on. Perhaps on this occasion the Commission made the decision not to include an executive summary to avoid that. But the failure to have some consolidated findings made it very difficult for me as a legislator to consume what happened. And certainly I can't say that I read the report in full, because it was incredibly difficult. It would require several readings of it, I think, to try and establish all of the facts in my own head. So I think there is more work to be done. I think the Disability Matters Committee is a place to do that. I would urge government to consider whether tribunals of inquiry provide, and I use that word value loosely again, provide value to the state, but particularly to the victims of tribunals, of the injustice that tribunals often investigate. I don't believe we can let Grace or other Graces out there remain in a situation where they may be at risk, and so I believe adult safeguarding is absolutely important. And I would call on the committee, and I will be calling on the committee to examine the situation where the omissions of the General Solicitor for minors and wards, where that was not included in this, that be examined. And perhaps it is required that the chair of the Commission comes before the committee in the same way as previous chair has done, and perhaps that would answer some of the questions that we have. I won't prejudge the discussion of my committee, but certainly I will be calling for the chair of this commission to come before the Disability Matters Committee so that we can try and examine some of the issues that have been raised. I commend the Minister in the way she has, as new to the office, the way you have addressed this issue. I suppose the proof of the pudding for this government will be the actions that we take that arise out of it. And as somebody who will be involved in the Disability Committee, I hope that they will be swift and fast, and that we will work together to ensure that there is some justice in terms of how things change going forward. Thank you, Kerlock.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move over to the Sinn Féin bench, and we have 5 minutes. You're sharing your time between just so, Deputy Carthy, you've maximum 2.5 minutes.
Here, look, always good to see a man in charge. I want to welcome the opportunity to speak on the Farrelly report. So many of us from all parties in the Oireachtas are just appalled by what happened to Grace, but also by the failure to deliver the justice and truth that she so deserved from the report of the Farrelly Commission. This is a very lengthy and costly report, Minister. 2,000 pages in length. It took 8 years. It cost €14 million, but it fails to deliver answers in relation to the appalling treatment of Grace, who was a vulnerable 10-year-old child when she entered care. So there must be answers and there must be accountability. The facts of this case are hard to believe. The house where Grace was placed was never assessed and was never formally recognised as a foster home. Grace was not visited by a social worker for the first 6 years. There were very serious and credible allegations of abuse, including sexual abuse, which the Commission has chosen to discount. The Commission has failed to address serious questions over why Grace was returned to the foster home after a decision had been made to remove her following accusations of abuse and neglect. We need to know why the Commission did not investigate the experiences of the other children and young people who went through the foster home in question. The case is a litmus test for how we treat the most vulnerable people in society, how we protect children and vulnerable adults, and we are failing. As the incoming chair of the Oireachtas Committee on Justice, Home Affairs and Migration, I will be seeing to it that this committee has a role in scrutinising the Farrelly report, including the revelation by Marie-Claire Butler, the General Solicitor for Minors and Boards of Court, that extensive submissions made on behalf of Grace to the Farrelly Commission were not included in the final report. To silence Grace in this way, after everything that she has been through, is nothing short of appalling. The report is a disservice to Grace, to all those who care for her, to other children and young people in care, and to those whistleblowers who spoke out. So the Oireachtas must insist, in my view, and I make this case very strongly, Minister, that Marjorie Farrelly, the author of this report, explain the omissions in her findings, including why the submissions of the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court on behalf of Grace were not included in the final report. It's the very least that Grace deserves.
Deputy Daly.
Look, it isn't the first time that we have been here about the state's failure of vulnerable children, and I think of the boarded out children in County Kerry in particular. It also won't be the last. Grace's story is another tragic example of a long list of failures, and after the Farrelly Commission, which took 8 years and 13.6 million, we're still in the dark on the critical issues. We do know that she was failed over and over again, and those who tried to speak up for her were shut down. Her own submissions were not included in the final report. She was only 10 when she entered foster care, no social worker visited her for 6 years, and while alarm bells rang about conditions in the home, she remained there for 20 years, and 47 other children were placed in that home and suffered sometimes harrowing abuse. The Commission decided not to examine this, though, as part of the investigation. She was forgotten by the state, and her case, although it's not unique, we had the Emily case, the ongoing Brandon case, the system continues to fail vulnerable people, in particular vulnerable children. But I want to raise two other issues, and we are still waiting for the review into CAMS services in North Kerry. After the Maskey report, 5 years ago now, it became immediately clear that the children who were treated in North Kerry were subject to the same failures as those in South Kerry. Over-medication, unnecessary antipsychotic medication with extreme side effects, pain, weight gain, breast milk even being expressed by some males, blunting of emotions, and one girl who I spoke to didn't even know whether she was real or in a video game, so cognitively impaired was she, lives ruined. Time after time we asked the HSE to include the patients who have received apologies in the redress scheme so that they're not further punished by having to fork out thousands of euro to bring their cases to justice. But this call has fallen on deaf ears. Finally, I would like to mention one other case. Many schools are waiting for extra hours of special education teacher time through the review process. And I was contacted recently by Castle Gregory Primary School, amongst others. Bogged down and bewildered by bureaucracy, spending precious time completing forms and providing further information, which seems designed to delay and to save money, cutbacks are constant, rather than helping the children who are in need of a continuum of support. Children with literacy and numeracy issues are not prioritised as much as they should, when those who need need sensory and movement breaks, who need help with social and emotional needs, trauma, autism and anxiety, and children with school avoidance issues are waiting. The NCSE say they don't have the final say, but who does? Following a review, schools are obliged to fall into one of 4 criteria to qualify. But how can schools prove that extra needs emerged in junior classes when the waiting lists for psychology and primary care is 4 years? They used to take complex needs into account, and a complete review is necessary here. And I thank the Cathaoirleach for the extra time. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move to the Independent Technical Group. Deputy Collins, just in time, and you have a maximum of 12 minutes. You go first. Okay, Deputy Flynn, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Count. The final report is not just a catalogue of failure, it's a national disgrace. And let us be clear, this did not happen in the shadows. This happened in the full view of the state, with the knowledge of senior officials and successive governments who chose to turn a blind eye. What this report exposes is not just incompetence, it is complicity. Children and vulnerable adults were failed again and again. Not because they didn't know, but because those in power didn't care enough to act. Whistleblowers were silenced and not supported. Frontline staff were ignored and not empowered. And instead of accountability, what did we get? Obstruction, denial, and extreme cowardice. And where was the government? Where were the ministers? Sitting on their hands, watching it happen, protecting the system instead of protecting the people we're meant to protect. This is not an admission of oversight. It is a political decision, a political culture that prioritises department reputation over people's lives. That shielded the senior management from scrutiny and punished those who spoke the truth. It is shameful, it is unforgiving, and it must end now. Minister, this culture must end now. This government has no right to claim surprise. The red flags were there for everyone. Their alarm bells were ringing for years, and yet nothing at all has changed, because it was easier to sacrifice the vulnerable than confront the powerful. And so I say to this government, to the Taoiseach, Tánaiste, and Minister here present, you don't get to wring your hands in sorrow now. You were warned, you were told, and you've done nothing. Let us not insult the Irish people with soft words and promises. And we need action. We need prosecutions, dismissals. We need to stop the culture of cover-up that plagues this state again and again and again. Because if we fail to act, if we allow this to become another report, another scandal, and yet another flippant apology, we are no better than those who looked away. The victims deserve justice. The whistleblowers deserve vindication, and the public deserve a government that does its job. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Deputy Collins.
Thank you very much indeed. The recent Farrelly Commission report, Minister, on the Grace foster home abuse case has caused a lot of public debate and concern. This investigation took almost 10 years and cost about $13.6 million. It found evidence of financial abuse and a serious lack of oversight by the South Eastern Health Board and the HSE. However, the report didn't find clear evidence of physical or sexual abuse, nor did it hold several officials accountable who are supposed to be overseeing Grace's care. This report is important today because it shows ongoing problems in our social care systems. The findings highlight the urgent need for better oversight and accountability to protect vulnerable individuals. The public's reaction to the report shows a broader demand for transparency and justice in handling cases of abuse and neglect. In today's context, the Farrelly Commission report is a stark reminder of the systematic flaws that still exist within our social care frameworks. It calls for immediate action to ensure that such failures are not repeated. The report's revelations have prompted calls for reforms to enhance the protection and care of vulnerable individuals, ensuring they receive the support they need. Moreover, the report's findings resonate with the ongoing discussions about the importance of safeguarding vulnerable population. As we navigate through these challenges, it's crucial to prioritise the well-being of those in care and to implement robust measures to prevent abuse and neglect. The Farrelly Commission report serves as a catalyst for change, urging policymakers and stakeholders to take decisive action to address these critical issues, Minister. In conclusion, the Farrelly Commission report has shed light on significant shortcomings within our social care systems. It has sparked a necessary conversation about the need for greater oversight, accountability and transparency as we move forward. It is essential to learn from these findings and to work collectively towards creating a safer and more supportive environment for all vulnerable individuals. The report's impacts will hopefully lead to meaningful reform that ensure the protection and well-being of those in care, preventing such tragedies from occurring in the future. The Farrelly Commission report indeed raises many questions, especially given the significant time and financial resources invested in it. The fact that it did not find conclusive evidence of sexual or emotional abuse despite the prolonged period of neglect and the serious allegations is troubling, Minister. It is important to acknowledge that the report's findings or lack thereof can feel disappointing or inadequate, particularly when considering the £13.6 million spent and the 8 years it took to complete. The absence of definitive answers about the abuse Grace may have suffered leaves many feeling that justice has not fully been served here. Neglect itself is a form of emotional abuse, and the environment Grace was in, with suggestions of sexual abuse, certainly raises concerns about her overall well-being during those years. The report's inability to provide clear conclusions on these matters can indeed seem like a significant oversight. This situation underscores the need for more rigorous and transparent investigations in the future. Ensuring that such reports provide comprehensive and conclusive findings is crucial for delivering justice and preventing similar cases from occurring. It also highlights the importance of continuous oversight and accountability within our social care system to protect vulnerable individuals effectively. More needs to be done to ensure that such investigations lead to meaningful outcomes and reforms. It's essential for policymakers and stakeholders to take these findings seriously, to work towards improving the systems in place to safeguard those in care.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Lawless, you have 3.5 minutes.
Very good. Firstly, I would like to start today by commending the last Cancorda Deputy John McGuinness for his great work, many years of work, and the enormous detail he has gone to in terms of highlighting this very tragic case of Grace. And I have no doubt that John, Deputy McGuinness, must be very disappointed today and over the last number of weeks in terms of the injustice and the lack of justice that was served in relation to this case. Child protection is a very important issue for us in Aintu, and we have serious problems and concerns with the Commission of Investigation in terms of the report that it has produced. Firstly, in its failure to conclude sexual abuse, despite the significant evidence and indeed a HSE payout. Secondly, in its attitude in terms of not following up on the other 47 children who were in this particular care home, it is really unthinkable that the Commission did not go to the lengths that it is required in order to find these cases and hear from the full 47 children in the care home. And thirdly, with the complete omission of the testimony supplied to the Commission from the lawyers representing Grace. The head of the Commission should come before an Oireachtas committee to answer questions in relation to the findings, questions around how it took €20 million of taxpayers' money and the fact that it took nearly a decade to produce. Separately, we in Aintu have discovered through freedom of information, and I would like to raise this with the Minister here today, that the National Independent Review Panel, the NIRP, which is tasked with examining similar cases in terms of severity to the cases of like Grace, have received 5 referrals from the HSE. Minister, the documents we have received are heavily redacted. However, we have been able to ascertain that in one of the reports relates to the horrific case of Brandon in Donegal. Another report relates to a 17-year-old girl by the name of Carrie, but who ultimately died of suicide. But we have no detail around Carrie's case and what happened to Carrie. And indeed, there are 3 other cases before the NIRP that we have no detail on whatsoever, Minister. So I would like to ask you, Minister, for transparency in relation to these cases. Are you aware of these reports, for example, and what is in them? And the saddest thing about the case of Grace and the Commission is that Grace was non-verbal and she was unable to speak for herself. And yet the testimony that was provided from her lawyers is not contained within the report. It really is a shocking situation.
Thank you. Deputy, no, okay, we'll move back to the government side. So, Deputy Keogh, you have a maximum of 15 minutes.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, this case strikes to the very heart of trust in our public institutions. It fills me with a deep sense of sorrow, but even more than that, a deeper sense of responsibility to speak here on the final report of the Farrelly Commission. Grace's case, or story, we might call it better, casts a dark shadow over how we have cared for one of our most vulnerable citizens. She is at the centre of this deeply troubling and unsettling report. Grace, who is now 40, was at the time just a young girl with profound intellectual disabilities who is non-speaking. And what happened to her is not just simply an institutional failure, it is a failure of humanity. Grace's story was a result of systemic failure that spanned decades. It is a story of neglect that was hiding in plain sight. The Commission, as we know, was tasked with examining the care provided in a state-funded placement where, despite multiple warnings and significant safeguarding concerns, Grace was left in a placement where allegations of sexual abuse had previously emerged. The report lays out a pattern of delay, deflection, and denial. It also unmasks a system that failed to act, failed to protect, and failed to listen. Years passed where critical information was buried in bureaucracy. Professionals within this case were constrained by poor communication and what appears to have been a worrying culture of risk aversion rather than child-centred action. We have to call this what it is, a profound and shameful failure to protect a young, vulnerable girl. It is an unpleasant thought that in 21st century Ireland, a vulnerable person in state care who was placed there for her protection could be left in a place where serious risks had already been documented. We have to ask, where was the joined-up thinking, where was the accountability, and I think more importantly, where was the basic human compassion? I understand that the HSE has made a series of apologies, 2 to Grace and 1 to Grace's mother. In the first apology to Grace, they cite the various failures that she experienced: inadequate monitoring and oversight of her care, an absence of necessary liaison between those responsible for her placement in the foster home, inadequate or timely action to remove her from her foster home after significant concerns had been raised, and an absence of the necessary protocols and arrangements to support the placement of vulnerable children and adults with a disability in foster families. They also apologised to Grace's mother for the failings in the care provided to her daughter while placed with a foster family for 20 years, up to, remarkably, 2009. I do welcome those apologies, but Grace was failed, not in one isolated incident, but Grace was failed repeatedly. And it is troubling to think that the very people who failed her were the ones that had a legal, moral and ethical duty to protect her. We owe Grace and all of the current and future vulnerable children a radically reformed system that places dignity, safety and accountability at its core. Minister Foley, you were right to acknowledge this situation as very dark and distressing, but it is not enough to acknowledge it, we must act. It is not enough to say we regret, and it is not enough to say this must not happen again. Grace, who is at the centre of this report, deserved dignity, safety and care, and she did not receive any of these. We must act, and we must do so with urgency and compassion, recognising that Grace's experience must never be repeated. I do want to thank the Commission for their final substantive report, and I want to pay particular tribute to those who did step forward to make protected disclosures relating to the handling of Grace's case, and also to the whistleblowers and people who did speak up around Grace. Their courage and persistence were instrumental in her finally being moved out of the foster home where she had been for 20 years. It is never popular, or it is never easy, to challenge wrongs in organisations. It often comes with personal struggles to those who do reach out, but it is brave and it is the right thing to do. We must go further than that, I believe, in every setting, be that schools, care settings, hospitals, playgrounds, even WhatsApp groups, chats in the bar. We must constantly challenge our peers and our colleagues when we are uncomfortable with what is being said or what is being done, especially when it comes to vulnerable children or adults. We must have conversations, even if it's just a response to a behaviour that we've seen or an interaction that we're just not sure of, just something that makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. It is important to say that since Grace's circumstances came to light, significant changes have been made to help safeguard against circumstances like this ever occurring again. However, the shortcomings identified highlight the importance of being ever vigilant and continually enhancing our approach to safeguarding of all vulnerable people in society. An expert-driven, non-statutory safeguarding exercise is now planned to identify learnings from the Commission's findings to inform present-day safeguarding policies and practices, and this is really welcome and really urgent. The programme from Government also sets out its commitment to advancing the rights and improving the lives of people with disabilities. We will prioritise the publication of and fund a new disability strategy setting out a vision to 2030. We intend to adopt a whole-of-government approach, and I think this is really clear in the new appointment of Minister Hildegard Naughton. We must implement the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the optional protocol to the Convention of Persons with Disabilities. There will also be a National Implementation and Monitoring Committee with enhanced political oversight to ensure delivery of the strategy. As chair of the Oireachtas Committee on Children and Equality and a member of the Disability Committee, and someone who worked for 19 years as a behaviour consultant with children just like Grace, I feel this case deeply and professionally. I have seen firsthand what happens when a child is described as non-speaking. I won't say non-verbal, because these children can often communicate very well through their gestures, sounds, body language and actions. Too often, behaviour can be described as challenging without the message that the children are trying to communicate being picked up on. I like to think of one of my superstars that I had the privilege of working with, and he might have been described as non-verbal and non-speaking, but his story changed because although he was unable to sit still and he wasn't able to speak with his voice, he wasn't able to complete tasks like inset puzzles, he got lots of therapy and lots of support from his parents. And then we discovered, actually, he can type. And after that, we realised that this boy does not have any cognitive difficulties. In fact, he knew all about space. He knew all about even Donald Trump, whether that was a good thing or not. And what we also learned was that he felt things immensely and he understood things immensely. 20 years ago, this boy would not have been able to communicate these ideas that he has. These were the days before AAC devices. The wonders of modern technology and these for non-speaking kids having access to AAC will mean that the future is bright for children like Grace, who was unable to give submissions to this report. She would be able to advocate for herself. She would be able to tell her carers when she needed to use the bathroom, when she wanted to listen to music, or when she had suffered harm by another. But let's be honest, no child should need to use their voice or a device to explain how they have been failed. Grace was failed repeatedly by the very people and institutions that were supposed to protect her. I have also seen the effects of systems that are too slow or overburdened, but none of what I have seen compares to what Grace endured. Grace was failed by those who did not listen to her in whatever way she was communicating and did not advocate for her. The circumstances of Grace's case were truly unacceptable and rightly caused great concern when they came to public attention. I'm very mindful, however, that circumstances involved extend to the 1980s, 1990s and 2000s, and there has been a marked change in the way we as a country operate in respect of child safeguarding, both in terms of the way vulnerable children are looked after when in the care of the state, and also the manner in which vulnerable adults with disabilities are cared for in the range of services available to them. We have seen the significant steps which have been taken from the development of foster care standards to the creation of the Ombudsman for Children's Office in HICWA, to the establishment of TUSLA and commencement of the Children First Act. A number of advances in safeguarding have also been developed in the adult safeguarding area, including the establishment of HICWA, which inspects residential services and centre-based respite services. The development of a HSE adult safeguarding policy in 2014, the establishment of a HSE National Safeguarding Office in 2015, and the regional safeguarding protection teams. The HSE published an independent review of its safeguarding policy procedures in 2024, which has led to the appointment of the HSE Chief Social Worker for the first time. I will go on and say we've done a lot more, but what I will say is I look forward to working with my colleagues within the Disability Matters Committee to ensure people with disabilities do not fall through the cracks. We need to close the gaps between agencies, and this requires a whole-of-government approach. We must be robust in ensuring protections for our most vulnerable. We must not allow the Farrelly Commission report to become just another document that collects dust. This report must be a catalyst for change. It must be a light beam, a glaring light beam shining down on all of the services that we have for people with disabilities, a glaring light for transparency and lasting change. We must continue to challenge our own bias when we meet children and adults with profound or perceived profound difficulties who are non-speaking. We must not presume that they're not able to advocate for themselves. We must never again allow silence or inaction. We must make it a turning point which signals to every vulnerable person in this country that they will be heard and they will be protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move over to Sinn Féin. You have a maximum of 5 minutes. You're splitting between 2.5 each. So, Deputy Kenny.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I suppose, Minister, one of the things that strikes me about all of this is that what sets the human being apart from all other mammals is that we have the ability to communicate. That's what makes us different, you know. And I was always struck by, you often hear it at table quizzes and stuff, what was the first 3 words in the Bible, but actually the second 3 words was more important. In the beginning, there was the Word. Words, we could speak, we could communicate, and that's why it's so vital that people who haven't got that ability to be able to clearly communicate, you know, and the previous speaker spoke of, you know, that it's not always verbal, but there is other ways of communicating. But those who can't clearly communicate are the ones that are most vulnerable. And in this particular case, there was clearly a person who was in the care of the state who was hugely let down, and they are not the only one. I bet you if you went around every member in this chamber, all of them would know someone, either a constituent or someone in their family or someone they know who was in similar circumstances, who feel there was big shadow over it, who there was difficulties there in the past, and this went on for years and years and years. And I acknowledge that things have changed, things have developed, things have improved in a lot of that, and there are better safeguardings in place, and you have HICWA and you have all of those things there. But I think the Farrelly report, and I want to turn to that for a moment, proves that nothing has changed when it comes to looking at the past. That we could spend over 13 million on a report that produces 0 is, I think, an indictment of the process that we have in place to be able to deal with these issues. I think that's the key factor here. While we have got the issue of the family involved and the huge hurt and the huge pain and all of that around that, we also have, and what we cannot escape, is that we spend so much money, that we spend so much time, so much effort, years, and what did we get? 0. And that tells us that the state has a problem, and the problem the state has is that it keeps covering for itself. And in some aspect of all of this, there needs to be transparency around all of that, that the state has to come clean when it comes to these issues, that it cannot continue to have this process where, you know, you cover up that bit and then you cover up another bit to cover up the next bit and cover up another bit to cover up the next bit. And that's what's going on in almost every institution of the state for years, where there has been mistakes made. Sometimes small mistakes have mushroomed into huge problems because of this culture of cover-up. And I think the Farrelly Commission report is an aspect of that that needs to be dealt with and needs to be dealt with urgency, Minister. And I would appeal to you to ensure that that happens.
Thank you, Deputy Quinn.
Minister, the Farrelly report left an awful lot of unanswered questions. The report did not deliver for Grace, didn't deliver for her mother. Grace was not heard. At a cost of £13.6 million, we expected clarity and we demanded more answers. Recently, in a short, precise seven-sentence press release, the General Solicitor, Marie-Claire Butler, who I know, Minister, you met recently, said that after examining the Farrelly Commission's 2,000-page report, she has concerns. She then described how her office considered and extensive submissions to the Commission were not included or referred to in any way in the report, an issue she said needs to be publicly aired, and this is utterly bizarre. Grace's story is a story of straight failure, a story of failure at every turn. Once again, in this state, a person with disabilities was failed. The report found that there was fundamental failure by the Health Board, the HSE in their duty of care, and serious neglect and financial mismanagement in terms of Grace. After 8 years of investigation, there remains a lack of answers and a lack of accountability in how this young woman was treated. The report itself demonstrates just how failed those with disabilities in care in the state can be. The Children's Residential and Aftercare Voluntary Association has repeatedly called for a review of Ireland's care system, and I urge the Government to ensure this happens as a priority. There remains a number of vulnerable people in the care of the state who are not getting the care and support they need from the state, and that also must change. More broadly, how people with disabilities are treated must dramatically improve. For instance, we have incredibly long waits for basic autism assessments. We all know, and experts tell us repeatedly, that early interventions is crucial for a child's development, and yet we have children waiting 32 months for an autism assessment in my own place of Limerick. Now is the time to deliver for people with disabilities in state care and improve the level of care provided. Now is the time to address the immense waiting lists for provision of services such as daycare, respite, waiting lists for assessment of needs and others. And now is the time to change the state's adversarial approach to victims, be it those who have been failed in state care or those such as the brave men who have dealt with for a number of years from the Cray Lane in the National School in Limerick. They had to fight every single step of the way to see the injustice done to them acknowledged. A group of men who have been champions of the issue that went through, an issue that was covered up by the Christian Brothers for years and years and years. A letter has emerged recently that showed that they knew in 1970, or 69 actually, that they had written confirmation that the abuser, the Christian brother, was an abuser. They were dragged through the courts. They had to go to Brussels. There was a Dáil motion here in the 32nd Dáil, and to this day yet, not all of those have been sorted out yet.
Thank you, deputies. We now move to other members. Deputy Attorney, you have a maximum of 8 minutes, and if your colleague comes in, I'll tap you at 4. Okay?
I'll keep an eye on the clock. He may appear. In this instance, the Farrelly Commission report, the phrase "man's inhumanity to man" springs to mind, and ordinarily that is reserved for war, for mistreatment during warfare. But I think it's very relevant in this instance. The value that we've placed on people, the value that was placed on Grace and the social care teams and members of those teams who came forward in a whistleblowing capacity. The tenet of treating others the way we want to be treated on so many levels, that has just been completely ignored. And how do we move forward from this? Because Grace's needs as a person were quite simple, sensory-based. She wanted her hair done and her nails done. And in the absence of being able to communicate those needs or to communicate the experiences that she had over those years in foster care, the very fact that the HSE reports around all of that were excluded, and the very fact that other ways of communication were not sought, for example, spell to communicate, art therapy, all of those newer therapies that we now know can be implemented to help people who can't speak, who are non-verbal, to communicate. In an era where these are the gold standards that we're trying to bring out to mainstream through schools, it's shameful that Grace's voice has been left out in all of this. And how do we go forward from here? How do we improve the situation? And I think the opinion of Inclusion Ireland is particularly relevant, and I'm going to quote Inclusion Ireland directly from their statement. Non-speaking people deserve the same access to justice as every other person living in this state. Will there be a full investigation? What is the rationale for the omission of Grace's voice, given that there are alternative means of communication in the era of technology? I suppose an area that I would be familiar with from my other work, the whole area of human resources, and that would bring me to the area of competency and capability of those within the system. And the word "the system" is something that we bandy about here quite often, but at the end of the day it does come down to people. What supports did people have to ensure that they could come forward if they had concerns? What performance reviews were carried out? What training was identified? What was the oversight process? And what happens next? Because we're left at the end of 2,000 pages and a 13 million expenditure and a protracted duration of inquiry, we're still left with questions rather than answers. And will this process, will it give confidence to other whistleblowers to come forward? Or can we ensure that as we move forward based on this experience of Grace and her family, will we have the confidence that we move forward that this won't happen again? Because we know already there's a crisis in the foster care system whereby people are slow to come forward for many, many reasons. But this situation and this report is off-putting in the least. That's by no means strong enough language for the situation. But in the Louth Meath area and the HSE-CH area, foster families numbers are in a crisis situation. And I just wondered of the knock-on effects. And ultimately, what will the actions be going forward to ensure that Grace's experience never happens again to any other vulnerable child or adult? I just hope that lessons are learned. I was disappointed not to get onto the Health Committee, but on reflection, to be involved in the Disabilities Committee moving forward. I just hope that all of the statements here, that we move forward to action on that committee and really make progress. Gurv Magat.
Thank you, Deputy Heenan.
You have. I really thank all the members of the House for everything they've already said about this. I don't want to be repeating what we know is wrong, but the real question is, what are we going to do to make sure it never happens again? This case really exposed more than individual failure. It exposed a culture of silence, of institutions more focused on protecting systems than protecting people. And when the person has failed, it's someone with intellectual disability, the failure cuts even deeper. So today, what I really want to ask is, what must we do right now? Firstly, we need to guarantee a permanently independent oversight of care placements for vulnerable children and adults. This means giving higher legal power to oversee of such placements, whether public or private or foster-based, and ensuring that no complaint, no red flag is ever allowed to sit unanswered again. Secondly, we need to ensure that voices of the people with disabilities are central to safeguarding. Grace couldn't speak up for herself, and when she did, no one listened, but others can, and we need formal supported mechanisms of self-advocacy, complaints and whistleblowing that are accessible, protected and listened to, like what happened in St John's Ambulance. Third, we need a full legislative review of how the HSE responds to the allegations of abuse and how TUSLA as well. Delays, files not followed up, concerns not acted on. This cannot be allowed to happen again. And fourth, we must commit to resourcing community-based supports, real alternatives to long-term institutional or any abuse for that matter. And Cathaoirleach, I'd also like to draw the attention regarding abuse to a young lady who I met outside the gates of this Dáil when I was going over to attend a reference in Buswells. Now, this was already brought up by another deputy sitting over here. It is the case of Katie Byrne, date of birth the 19th to the 11th. I'd really ensure that this can be looked into as soon as possible. She's currently being abused. She's waiting 14 years for her to get an assessment and to get the care that she critically needs. And I'd urge the department and for the government to give this young woman the care that she needs rather than failing again. And I know you've a huge job ahead of you, and I know you've been engaged with me very proactively regarding other things. So I hope that you can look into this case, and I really thank you very much.
Okay. Deputy, names and dates of birth.
Apologies.
Shouldn't be given out.
Apologies for
House.
that. Yeah,
okay.
Just to get attention to the case.
Well, yeah, okay.
I didn't give the full date of birth.
I just have to point it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Minister Foley's reply. You have 10 minutes, Minister. Thank you.
I would like to thank all the deputies who have contributed to this debate on the final substantive report of the Farrelly Commission, and I intend to respond to as many of the issues as I can. I must start at the outset, however, by emphasising that the Commission of Investigation is an independent statutory commission empowered to investigate matters of significant public concern, possessing robust investigative powers and, by design and by law, exercising its functions and powers independently of government, independently of the Minister of the day, and independently of the department. This is as it should be. The very essence of an inquiry is that it should not be subject to political interference. As the House is aware, and indeed many deputies have referenced, I did meet with the General Solicitor for Minors and Wards of Court, Grace's legal advisor, recently. The General Solicitor has a number of functions in respect of vulnerable persons, and acting under the direction of the President of the High Court is responsible for the legal, personal and financial affairs of Grace. The General Solicitor confirmed that Grace is happy and is living a meaningful and fulfilled life. The General Solicitor further confirmed that Grace is well looked after and there is regular oversight of her care in her home, including by the President of the High Court. As regards the engagement I had with the General Solicitor, she confirmed that the purpose of the meeting with her was to ensure that I, as Minister, was aware that she had made considered and extensive submissions on the draft report on behalf of Grace to the Commission of Investigation prior to publication of the final report. The General Solicitor highlighted potential learnings for investigations in the future into issues involving people with disabilities also. The General Solicitor was clear that management of the submissions it made to the Commission remains and still is a matter for the Commission itself. Separately, I received correspondence from the Commission stating that the Commission of Investigation had fully discharged its obligations under Section 34 of the Commissions of Investigation Act 2004. The Commission further confirmed its view that all steps were duly taken in considering submissions received, including those made on behalf of Grace. I note that several deputies have called for a new model of inquiry into matters of significant public concern in the future. The Commission of Investigations Act 2004 was introduced to provide a faster and more cost-efficient method of public inquiry following concerns about the lengthy time of public tribunals. I've asked officials of my department to identify any possible learnings from the Farrelly Commission in terms of a future model for public inquiries, particularly in relation to people with disabilities. For the information of the House, I have also arranged to meet with Keelan Gallagher, the Special Rapporteur on Child Protection, to discuss the concerns she has raised following the publication of the Farrelly Commission's report. I acknowledge too that many deputies have expressed the desire for an executive summary of the Farrelly Commission's final substantive report. I have indicated myself that an executive summary would have allowed greater accessibility to those impacted by the report and indeed accessibility for the public at large. However, for the information of the House, the Commissioner's view is that it would have been impracticable to provide an executive summary, having regard to the detailed factual background derived from the evidence contained in its 3 substantive reports. That is the view of the Commission. One of the Commission's terms of reference, known as Part X, relates to whether the facts and information gathered in the course of the inquiry warrant scope for any further work which the Commission could undertake in the public interest. This involved 47 cases where other children had stayed with Mr X and Mrs X in their home as part of fostering or respite arrangements. The Commission states in Part X, terms of reference, there were no prosecutions recommended by An Garda Síochána or directed to be taken by the DPP in the case of any of the 47 service users. The Commission's statement on Part X conclusions indicates that there is an absence of information in the possession of the Commission identifying issues for further investigation with respect to matters to do with the role or conduct of public authorities in respect of 7 cases identified akin to the type of concerns raised in respect of Grace, save for 2 cases where the role of public authorities has already been investigated and reported upon by the Commission. The circumstances of Grace's case were truly unacceptable and rightly have caused grave concern when they came to public attention. I want to pay tribute again to the whistleblowers who made protected disclosures relating to the handling of Grace's case. Their courage and persistence were instrumental in her finally being moved out of the foster home where she had been for 20 years. The Farrelly Commission's final substantive report found there was an absence of oversight and monitoring of Grace in her placement by the South Eastern Health Board and the HSE, and that there was a fundamental failure of their duty of care to Grace in the circumstances. I know deputies have questioned what accountability will follow on foot of the publication of the report. The report has been sent to all necessary state bodies, including the HSE and TUSLA, which took over responsibility for child and family services from the HSE when it was established in 2014. The HSE and TUSLA are considering the report in detail and will be taking any action required on foot of its findings. While it is never possible to say with 100% certainty that a safeguarding issue cannot occur in any setting in the future, there has been a marked change in the way we as a country operate in respect of child safeguarding, both in terms of the way vulnerable children are looked after when in the care of the state and also the manner in which vulnerable adults with disabilities are cared for in the range of services available to them. With respect to vulnerable children in the care of the state, safeguarding has become a priority for these children, both from a legislative and policy perspective. We have seen the significant steps which have been taken from the development of foster care standards to the creation of the Ombudsman for Children's Office and, of course, HICWA, to the establishment of TUSLA and the commencement of the Children's First Act. Collectively, these steps represent a very significant shift in the way we treat children who require the care of the state, who have a right to be protected by the state and rely on us to do so. A number of deputies have expressed concern about the care and monitoring of children who are being looked after in special emergency arrangements which are not registered for the purposes of inspection by HICWA. The use of special emergency arrangements has been necessary due to an unprecedented number of child protection referrals to TUSLA and a surge in unaccompanied minors into the state from Ukraine and other non-EU countries. This has increased the demand on TUSLA in terms of securing available accommodation. There are currently 151 children in special emergency arrangements, of whom 104 are separated children seeking international protection. TUSLA has assured me that there is a vetting and inspection process for the providers of these special emergency arrangements. Staff in the special emergency arrangements must be Garda vetted before any child is placed there. Young people in special emergency arrangements are visited weekly by a social worker or delegated person to have their voice heard and check on the care being provided. TUSLA are working with the providers of special emergency arrangements with a view to converting them into registered and regulated service providers, thus making them subject to independent HICWA inspections. TUSLA has advised that 4 services have successfully obtained a registration in this manner to date, with a further 14 applications under assessment. HICWA also has an important role in relation to adult safeguarding. It inspects residential services and centre-based respite services. The development of an HSE adult safeguarding policy in 2014, which covers all services and settings, was an important development in adult safeguarding. A national safeguarding office was established in 2015, and safeguarding protection teams across all the HSE's community health organisations were introduced to provide community safeguarding responses as well as quality assurance, oversight and advisory support to HSE and funded service providers on safeguarding matters. The HSE published an independent review of its policies and procedures last year, and this has led to the introduction of a chief social worker in the HSE for the very first time, one who is driving the implementation of the recommendations in the report. There has also been strong progress made in relation to mandatory reporting of all suspected abuse of children, be it physical, sexual, emotional or neglect. But I recognise that many deputies, organisations representing people with disabilities and groups like the Irish Association of Social Workers have flagged up the lack of mandatory reporting for the abuse of vulnerable adults. I agree that we need robust adult safeguarding legislation with mandatory reporting to protect vulnerable adults. This falls within the remit of the Department of Health, and they are currently developing a new policy on adult safeguarding in the health and social care sector to cover the full spectrum of healthcare and social care services. This new policy on adult safeguarding is being developed in consultation with my department, and I understand from the Department of Health it will be brought before Government in the coming months. The preparation of related underpinning legislation will commence immediately thereafter. The commencement of the Assisted Decision Making Act 2015 in 2023 enhances protections and safeguards around decision making for vulnerable adults lacking capacity. The Law Reform Commission's report for a regulatory framework for adult safeguarding across all sectors was published in 2024 and accompanied by draft legislation in the form of the Civil Adult Safeguarding Bill and a Criminal Justice Adult Safeguarding Bill. The report sets out a range of recommendations for future government consideration in regard to adult safeguarding. These recommendations include new duties and responsibilities to improve the accountability of those charged with looking after a specified category of at-risk adults, that is, vulnerable people who need to be protected. Deputies have also mentioned the importance of adult safeguarding in the context of other previous cases. The Brandon report into the sexual abuse of intellectually disabled residents at a health executive HSE-run care facility, which was truly shocking. It outlined a number of recommendations also. This included the establishment of the strategic working group tasked with the development of a new vision for disability services in the area, a high-level report outlining the strategic working group's work to date and providing an independent and objective assessment of the safeguarding structures and procedures in place in disability services and community healthcare. Cavan, Donegal, Leitrim, Monaghan and Sligo was requested from the independent chair, Colm Lehan, in 24, and I expect to receive a report on the matter in the coming weeks. I will conclude. I appreciate that my time has run out, but I do want to say that I absolutely welcome the contributions and the sincere and heartfelt contributions from everyone here and indeed from wider society. And I want to assure you that we are mindful of the job of work that needs to be done. Much has been achieved, but I'm under no illusions an awful lot more needs to be done in this space. And I want to conclude by saying that Grace and all of the other children, young people and families involved in this inquiry must be at the forefront of our thoughts at all times and indeed influence our actions today, tomorrow and beyond.
Okay.
Like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.